Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. That's a hard act to beat, but we'll try. I think Avinash is sort of, we're justified in describing Avinash as a sort of a historian, analyst, and I'm hoping this evening a bit of a geopolitical entertainer as well. So, that was my bridge joke. You are free to laugh if you wish. Yeah? But as we have, our Benny very kindly introduced us, so I'm just going to cut straight to the chase. Of course, we'll sort of a journey with Avinash and his work for the next 30, 35 minutes or so, at which point of time I would like to invite the House to join into the conversation. Just a small request. Please ask a brief question if you must. Please don't say an observation and a question and then spend the next 5 minutes, because then you're going to miss out on the reason why we are here, is to hear from Avinash about his experience, his journey with India's Near East, the book, as well as the region. Avinash, super to meet you. And I actually am very, very keen about your book, and I've read it, of course, from cover to cover, and with a keen recognition of the fact that, I pretty much work in the same area or the same geography or the same political geography, or even the historical geography. But unlike you, who as a historian, you wear a historian's lens, I tend to wear the lens of a sort of a more granular, on-the-ground sort of person who looks at conflict and why conflict exists and the interconnectedness of conflict between the various countries of South Asia. So your work and your approach was very, very valuable for me and for all of us, because what you've done in, my apologies, Avinash is entirely too polite to plug his own book, so let me do it for him. India's Near East. For those of you who haven't come by the book, pick up a copy. You must, I insist. It's a fine book. But, because, and what fascinated me about this book, Avinash, is that you've managed to, as a historian does, you've managed to sort of take an eagle-eye view. You've managed to zoom out, while many of the details, and we will come to, I'll try and prompt you to share some of those details with us. You've taken you've zoomed out onto this region, as ladies and gentlemen, some of you would know, those of you who are practitioners, that the region, East and South Asia, in this Near East that Avinash writes about, is actually is an amazing melting pot, an amazing geopolitical sweet spot. We tend to forget just how much the eastern aspect of South Asia is driven by borders. You have China, you have Nepal, you have Bhutan, you have Bangladesh, with which India has an inescapable 4,000 plus kilometer border, of which more tomorrow. And you have Myanmar. And it is a sort of a heaving, seething place, and has been so for hundreds of years and for the past several decades, and right up until now. Why did you, what drove you to focus on this particular region? Because your other work is a little different. And why were you drawn to because I live with the complexity of India's Near East. I'm very interested to know from you what drew you to this amazingly complex, very enriching, and absolutely exasperating part of South Asia.
Sudeep, first of all, thank you so much for being here. There is a saying that a lot of scholars, especially if you're a new entrant to a region, and I am a new entrant to India's East, Near East, Far East, East and South Asia, you call it as you like it, but we stand on the shoulder of giants, so thank you. I've learned so much from your own work, a lot of work, and you've dedicated, decades worth of your time and work to this region. So I've learned a lot for that, and I'm honored to be here with you. And you were absolutely right earlier when you said that it's a tough act to follow after those musical performances earlier, those lovely songs. I was actually thinking, do I need to sing something to catch your attention? Hopefully not. Look, there are two reasons why I came to this particular geography, this particular demography. There is a professional, intellectual reason for this. And then the more I think about it, I think there's a deeply personal reason for it. Now, the intellectual reason is very, very clear to me. I am a political scientist before I'm a historian. My mind is of a political scientist. My heart is of a historian. And I want to always, my pursuit of knowledge is really to understand, how does India practice power? How did India, independent India, build itself as a nation and the various ideas that informed its nation building? And how does it project power outside of its territorial boundaries as it imagines them to be? And power not just in terms of ideas or institutions or diplomatic statements, right? Or cultural power, soft power. Actual, real, hard power. And one of the regions in which India has demonstrated the capability to use force, military force, is the subcontinent. So that is the anchor for most of my research. My first book, which emerged out of my doctoral studies, was India's approach towards the wars in Afghanistan. Right from 1979, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, to the US-led NATO intervention post-2001 after 9/11. How does India deal with it, given its own imperatives of rivalry with Pakistan? And that's what took me to India's Near East. This is arguably one of the most intricately partitioned lands anywhere on earth. Right? Whether it's territorially, demographically, there are inner line permits, there's a hill-valley divide, there are various kind of communities practicing different religions, speaking different languages, and then there are actual partitions. The partition of Bengal, the separation of Burma. When we talk about partitions, we often forget Burma separated from India or then colonial India in 1937, and that was just as important in shaping our own outlook towards that country and how it shaped India as the 1947 kind of partition, or 1971, the liberation of Bangladesh. So that's the professional, intellectual reason. I'll stop with the personal. That is deeply personal. Look, I'm a Delhi boy. I grew up in Delhi, and when I was working in a Delhi think tank, and trust me, if you work in a Delhi think tank, you know.
My commiserations, but do go on.
In Delhi think tanks, sometimes it's easy to slide into this space where you think you know everything. And my friends from Assam, Nagaland, they'll at some point tell me, यार तुम लोगों को ना कुछ समझ नहीं है हमारे इलाके की और ना ही कोई फर्क पड़ता है तुम्हें. You don't really understand the northeast of India, the complexities of it, and you actually don't even care. That's what Delhi effectively is. And somewhere it's stuck. So I can't still vouch for understanding, but at least with this book, I can go back to my friends and say that, look, I care.
Well done. But I'm not withdrawing my remark about commiserating with you. But this gives me an entry, Avinash, and ladies and gentlemen, to come to the first phase of our journey this evening. When Avinash spoke of independence, and let me just throw this open to you, Avinash, and I'd love to know, is that, when I look at how India on the make, or India in the making, not even 47, 46 actually, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, so on and so forth, the 50s decade, much of the 60s, when India was looking at what you call India's Near East, or you call it the Northeast, or India's Far East, as I like to call it, that was a time when India was being put together, literally stitched together, and a lot of the present that we've inherited from that past, at least to me, seems like a sort of a paranoid reaction often, saying when somebody would speak of a simple need of respect and dignity and autonomy, not autonomy of territory, but autonomy of purpose, yes, autonomy of aspiration, then often the reaction from New Delhi, then as sometimes even now, was an overreaction, the way I would look at it. And a lot of the schisms and, it's sort of that kind of reaction played to the fault lines rather than actually playing to the notion of integration to some extent. And the 50s, you had the raging Naga conflict took off. Shortly, you had Manipur join the angst of Northeast. You had, of course, Mizoram in the 1960s come together, which you detailed very nicely, well done. I'm a great admirer of his work. Some of the things on Mizoram that Avinash has talked about, especially the intelligence, his digging into the archives of the intelligence agencies and the correspondence between politicians and leaders of the region to New Delhi. I want you to talk about that a little later. My point is that I just want to set up your next bit of conversation with the House, is how do you see that progression, or should I call it evolution, of these formative years of overreaction in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s to the kind of the grappling that one has to deal with now, the kind of almost an overreaction of peacemaking, which leads to another side of the spectrum and leads to its own problems because you're perhaps overcompensating. Could you sort of share some of those thoughts with us?
Yes, you actually, that's an excellent question. See, there are two elements to it, and the temporality of it, the 50s to 60s to 70s. I mean, you're looking at different Indias in some senses, right? 50s, not just India, even Pakistan and Burma, as it was then called, these are newly decolonized states which are deeply insecure about themselves. And insecure not just in terms of who should be a citizen, how should we govern, the constitutional making debates, what should be the relationship between the civilian political formations and the armed forces. We forget that a lot of the British Indian Army, which would then, of course, then become Pakistan Army or the Indian Army, most of the officers had fought in the Second World War. So use of force was it came very naturally in those contexts. And these states were very clear that, look, because we are so insecure, there has to be a constitutional undergirding, a constitution that undergirds our realities, our present realities post 14th and 15th August 1947. You're dealing with very kind of potent, violent questions around how to deal with the minorities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, many of whom felt this was also a moment to assert their own sense of independence. And the Naga movement was born arguably in the trenches of the Second World War. And you can see constitutionalism then becomes the straw that the Indian Republic's founding kind of leaders really hang on to very tightly. That constitutionalism is what guides us. Having a constitution is one of the most important things. It almost becomes biblical in some senses, right? The constitution has to be protected at any cost. Now, Burma had a constitution, Pakistan would have a constitution a lot later, but these solidarities between Burma, Pakistan, and India really came to define the decade of the 1950s. You can actually see Indian and Pakistani leaders saying we need to work together. The Nehru-Liaquat Pact of 1950 was effectively about this, that look, you protect the minorities, the religious minorities in your state, and I'll protect the minorities in my state, because the moment they move, they bring a lot of trauma, and the more trauma they bring, it polarizes the domestic politics, my domestic political life, right? So that was fundamentally what was undergirding. And I'll come to, you mentioned intelligence, thanks for doing that. It is surreal that in 1949, the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, and the Indian Intelligence Bureau were working together after having fought a war over Kashmir just last year to actually save the Burmese government from falling. They were literally working together to arm the Burma army to make sure that, look, we don't want you to fall to communism. By 60s and 70s is a very different story. Those solidarities that were kind of present in the 50s, that gave way to competitive politics. Now it was about, how can we outcompete now that we are broadly secure territorially to a certain extent? How can we outcompete our neighbors, and how can we increase the cost of our neighbors? And the 1962 war with China, and the 1965 war with Pakistan that India fought, and the experience of that war really securitized India's thinking, both about itself, its northeast, which had already become very securitized by late 1950s with the introduction of Armed Forces Special Powers Act. They became competitive. They started supporting ethnic separatism in each other's states, covertly or overtly at times, to say that, look, this is how we're balancing our geopolitical needs and imperatives. No more solidarity anymore. Yeah.
Well, I can't help slip in a little anecdote here about the Naga. I don't know if you came by this, but I did, and I wrote about it in a book. When the Nagas were sort of negotiating or approaching the Simon Commission from the late 20s, and it carried on to the early 30s as well, till there was this little quip that I heard, that the Nagas are very concerned that the black man was going to take over. So they actually petitioned saying that, we heard that the white king is going away and that the black man is going to be taking over the Naga hills. But they were mollified. But they had a demand, persistent demand, that they could live with the black man taking over sort of the administration of the Naga Hills in the Tuensang district, as it came to be called, but they were very, very definite that they didn't want a Bengali to do so. I just thought I would put it there. Being Bengali myself, we need to even grab infamies and indignities as our very own, because we are the best at what we do. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. Speaking of Bengalis, Bangladesh, which many people, I've heard, I don't know if you have heard, but in India, when a lot of people look at Bangladesh, they say, seriously, do you have Bengalis there at all? And sometimes I have to explain to them, it's in the name of the country. Bangladesh is literally in the name. Having said that, there is and of course I said more of it later, so the way I would approach Bangladesh to you would be a more sort of a historical evolution in many ways, like you address this thing. The kind of aspects you deal with in your book where in the 50s and 60s, like you've talked about the relationship that the ISI and RNAW and other agencies had, not RNAW then, but the other agencies had, well, not ISI then either, but other agencies had with, in the case of Burma and so on and so forth. You also talk in quite a granular detail about how India was viewing the eastern aspect of Pakistan, East Bengal or East Pakistan, and how that relationship grew to pretty much what brings us to the phase of 1971. And also, in a way, the collapse of 1975. Please note, ladies and gentlemen, he's very symbolically wearing a black coat. And he asked me to point it out to all of you. This is to celebrate the phase 1971 to 1975. Or should I say
there is absolutely no political symbolism to what I'm wearing.
Okay, so, no, so...
this is not Dhaka.
Correct. But take us through a bit of that, those years when India was dealing with the situation where it was transitioning quite clearly, as you point out, from the entity called East Pakistan to what was already evident that it would become something else pretty quickly. So can you because that dynamic, I mean, it lives with us to the present day.
You're absolutely right, Sudeep. Look, 1971, I think, is perhaps much more important today in some senses, or the memory of 1971, right? What it means for a country, a people, is much more valuable or important for India than perhaps it's for the younger generation of Bangladeshis who want to kind of, look back at that moment with a bit more distance and a bit more kind of circumspection as to what really happened. In fact, a kind of a very regular narrative you hear from Bangladesh is that, look, this was not India-Pakistan war, this was our war. This was a war of the liberation of the people of Bangladesh, not really India's war. And that is still a tiff between the two countries. What was eye-opening for me was India's relationship with East Pakistan before 1971. Most histories, and I'm talking about at least academic histories, would focus on pre-1971 period and look at Pakistan and India relationship, but primarily look at India's relationship with the junta. I mean, their colleagues like Pallavi Raghavan, who has done excellent work on the early 50s, but then there is a gap as to what happens. A lot of that story was being told primarily based on what was then West Pakistan, not East Pakistan. India, actually, there was a huge debate after the 1965 war and the 1966 outbreak of the Mizo-insurgency. Now you truly have a 2.5 front war scenario facing and it's a very real scenario, right? It's not hypothetical. If you have to fight both China and Pakistan and a series of kind of, separatist movements in your northeast, then how do you deal with it? And I think the debate at that point was, especially from the diplomatic side of India's kind of, state establishment, was that, look, a united Pakistan with a non-Punjabi leadership or a Bengali Pashtun leadership in a united Pakistan perhaps will be much more forthcoming to the Indian narrative on Kashmir. So Bacha Khan with Sheikh Mujibur Rahman leading a united Pakistan is in our interest. And that debate lasted till 25th March 1971, at least, right, when Operation Searchlight was launched by the Pakistani army. The other side of the debate, and this is often, it is not often kind of appreciated as much, was the security argument that, look, this is pure naivety. Pakistan, regardless of whether it's a Bengali, a Pashtun, or a Punjabi at helm, will never give up on its core demands on Kashmir, something as kind of, entrenched an issue as Kashmir. So the only way to solve the half of your 2.5 front problem is perhaps to think about dismembering Pakistan, right? And you can see India's intelligence kind of agencies starting to put the building blocks of that process that, look, worst comes to worst, you can run a long insurgency in Pakistan just the way in India's mind Pakistan was running by supporting the Mizo armed groups and the Naga armed groups. You can pay back in the same coin in East Pakistan. If not, then dismemberment or liberation becomes a very real option. And I think it became a very real option by mid-1971. And this is also where I would say the embers of India's kind of disconnect with Bangladesh or independent Bangladesh, liberated Bangladesh, really kicked in as well. I don't think India realized that there was still a body of opinion in East Pakistan which did not want liberation, right? And even if they accept, you ended up supporting one figure at that point in time, that was Sheikh Mujib, so much so that India got construed as Sheikh Mujib and Sheikh Mujib as India, even though behind the scene, the relationship was very, very complicated, just like today, unfortunately, right? India was seen as supporting one figure more than the people of Bangladesh, that was Sheikh Hasina, Mujib's daughter, and we can see what happened around that.
But there is this. I mean, this again let's us segue into another part of the conversation. Is that when I look at these histories and these developments, whether internally or externally, and here, ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to say that my young colleague here, it belongs to my tribe. Sorry, I'm claiming primacy of that. Because when we look at these regions and we look at people and look at histories and look at presents and we look at futures, we look at the interconnectedness of things, and which is why I'm so fond of the work that Avinash has done with India's Near East, is that he has melded the domestic compulsions of a country, i.e. India, or for that matter, Bangladesh or Myanmar, or China, or Nepal, or Bhutan, for instance, and seen how domestic policies and domestic compulsions of a country really drive foreign policy or foreign actions or actions, bilateral or multilateral actions, or actions related to diplomacy, actions related to maybe intelligence, the intelligence aspect of it all, or the sort of the great game within East and South Asia. And there is a great game. Let's not kid ourselves that there isn't. Now, while we know that, and Avinash sees that, and he's integrated this sort of worldview into his book of a very fine history, I keep getting drawn to the fact that we seem to be, and here, when I say we, I mean India. And because we are in Jaipur, we are in India, let's for the moment use an India pivot for this conversation. It seems that India and others also, we seem to be privileging, in a way, through our insecurities perhaps, or our domestic compulsions, a certain kind of, we privilege a growth of violence, if you will. And I call it privileging violence because sometimes you don't see that a Bangladesh exists. You don't see that India's Near East exists. You don't notice Myanmar until Bangladesh or Myanmar or some other regions begin to implode, maybe sometimes by your own actions. And then you wake up and say, hey, we have a 1,600 plus kilometer long border with Myanmar. Oh my God, we have a 4,096 kilometer border with Bangladesh. What on earth are we going to do with it? Without realizing that Bangladesh is asking pretty much the same question. What on earth are we going to do with this 4,096 kilometer long border with India? And so on and so forth. So could you take us to, because you've tracked this history, and it often seems that, when we talk about bilaterals, we're actually talking about unilateral action and unilateral narrative and unilateral histories. And could you take us through some of your observations about the region from this point of view of privileging violence or ignoring the existence of another geography or a country till we're taken by the scruff of our necks and, we're saying, look at us, because we matter.
No, absolutely, Sudeep. See, it's amazing. I'll give you an example. Whenever I look at this particular geography, and of course the people of this region, from a policy lens, what you hear almost all the time is India's look east policy, as if we were not looking before. India's act east policy, as if we were not acting before. And we need to connect. You know, connectivity is the mantra. You connect and everything will be solved. You build that rail line, you build a port, you build a bridge, you build a road, put some money in investment, goods should and services should move. And the more I hear that in a policy sense, the more I realize how disconnected and partitioned the region actually truly is, not just practically, but also in a psychological sense, right? There's almost a dissonance, at least when you come to a more statist view of it from New Delhi. And my book, in some senses, was to try to kind of obviate a lot of these kind of disconnects, right? But India is a domestic actor in Bangladesh, whether we like it or not. And Bangladesh today is a domestic presence in Indian politics, right? In not particularly helpful, healthy ways, but it is. And that shows you something. And the fact that today, and even in the past, right, Delhi has dealt with a lot of anxiety whenever there has been a transition of power in Dhaka. It continues to show that this disconnect actually persists. Now, name me one bridge or one port or one railway line or one whatever you want to build. How much connectivity can I build if one is calling the people who you want to connect with termites?
Well, more on that tomorrow, but point taken. Talk about Myanmar. Talk about China in this aspect. Talk to us a little bit about Bhutan, if you will. But Myanmar, China for sure, in this similar construct about sort of waking up one morning and saying, okay, we have to deal with things beyond 1962. And we're dealing with borders here. We're dealing with very real borders. We're dealing with the free movement regime with Myanmar. We're dealing with aspects where we're fencing borders, not only with Bangladesh, but with Myanmar now too, because of the situation in Myanmar. There are new dynamics in place. And I want you to not, a part of a historian's role, and as you're a political scientist as well, is to sort of hyper jump a little bit project a little bit into the future as well. So when we talk about history, Avinash, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how you want to travel with that history and how you see that projecting into the future. So do share something with us about Myanmar and China and Bangladesh, if you will, but a little less on Bangladesh because we have a main event tomorrow. Do come for that, 3 p.m. in Surya, at the Surya Hall. And can you take us a bit through that, please?
Yes, again, look, on Myanmar, what I found more interesting was actually, again, the domestic, external kind of, interplay. When we look at Myanmar from an Indian perspective, first of all, it was very difficult because consciously I had to retrain my mind to say that, look, first you have to consider Myanmar as part of the subcontinent. This is a country which is straddling Southeast Asia and South Asia, and for me, it's as much part of subcontinent as perhaps Nepal, Bhutan, or Bangladesh, or India, Pakistan, right, Sri Lanka. So that was one psychological kind of trapeze act for me. What I found interesting, apart from all the things that you mentioned, right, the border, the free movement regime, the trans-border connectivity, movement of armed actors across the border, the illicit drug trade, or just illicit trade of daily use items as well. What I found interesting was the fact that in Yangon, one of the institutions which is still active and has been active since the 1950s, early 1950s, was the Swayamsevak Sanatan Dharam. And not once in the history of Myanmar, that institution has been stopped from practicing whatever it practices. And it's a very important institution for the social and cultural and daily welfare of many Hindu communities that live in Myanmar and have historically been persecuted as well, right? The history of persecution is not just between India and Bangladesh. Myanmar has a very, unfortunately, rich history of persecuting minorities, one of which was Indians. In fact, the largest exodus of Indians after independence happened from Myanmar, which is, again, very easy to forget. And for me, that was very, very telling. When I was there on the ground and asking them, why is it that you are able to function in a country where Buddhist majoritarianism is so central to the political being of the country and very important for the junta, right? And their argument was very simple, that Hinduism is an issue of Rashtravad or nationhood in India. But for us, Hinduism is just a cultural kind of aspect. We do not take our practices into the political realm, and that's a very nice balance that we have struck with Buddhism. And I really sincerely hope some scholar would look at the relationship between Hinduism in those contexts in Buddhist-dominant countries in the neighborhood.
Seriously?
I think I hope so. I hope someone would actually, kind of unpack those dynamics. And what made me realize that this is actually an important history to look at was a case, and I'll give you a very quick example. In 1992, when Babri was demolished, of course, Bangladeshi reaction was expected, right? It is a Muslim country. There was a lot of anger. There was a lot of riots against and violence against Bangladeshi Hindus. But Myanmar, the ambassador, and he's on the record, came and said nothing. And when later on he was asked by a journalist that, look, you're the Burmese or Myanmar ambassador to Delhi, something such so seismic has happened, what do you have to say? And you know what he said? He was like, look, this is what good neighborly relations are all about. I don't comment about your domestic politics. Don't comment about my domestic politics.
But that, yes, I mean, that is sort of the
it's not central, I see your point.
It's I mean, it's sort of an ideal, I mean, by the way, this is structured as what we Bengalis call adda, which is basically a sort of a conversation, like a fireside chat or something that we have in a sort of a friendly way, but we can agree to disagree, and so I'm just sort of chipping in here.
Please disagree.
But I am. Yes. Sorry, I'm kidding. But I'm trying to sort of nudge you into a direction saying, okay, here we have these strands, and I really want you to address the future as you see it, because we have these sort of strands of history that are coming together, falling apart, running in parallel, diverging, converging. And as we all know, South Asia is beyond complex. I mean, we live with that daily. But when you see these little things that we talked about, or grand things we talked about this evening, when we stitch it all together, what future are we presented, Avinash, when you look at the history of South Asia? And I want to really have you talk about this, because I think after that I would like to bring you, ladies and gentlemen, into the conversation. And I think this might be the right springboard from which to do that. So when you look at the past that you have, and where do you see this sort of subcontinental, or the India's Near East, if I may, to use the name of your book, where do you see the near future of India's Near East?
Sudeep, the history in South Asia rhymes as future. And, I've learned this in the past 6 months. I was telling, Ambassador Ganguly Das is sitting here. After 1975, when Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was killed, it was on 15th of August, 1975, the debates, the issues, the dynamics between India and Bangladesh that evolved. Of course, everything is not the same. There are very important differences as well. But the issue of minorities, the issue of what will the army do, the issue of should India use force or should India be more calm and restrained, almost all those debates are playing out in similar forms today. And that worries me, because if you ask me a futuristic question as a historian or a political scientist even, I'll look back and say, okay, this has happened before. We are not dealing with new Bangladesh. This is a very old Bangladesh we're dealing with. So what will happen? I genuinely hope that, the 1st of February 2021, when the junta did a coup in Myanmar, 3rd of May 2023, when Manipur imploded, and 5th of August 2024, when Dhaka, the regime of Sheikh Hasina fell in Dhaka, these are 3 dates that should be etched in our memories to show that, it's very easy to spark communal disharmony, but it's very difficult to tame these fires once you have put the light or you have matched it starts when the wildfire really begins of violence. In the near term, I do not foresee any particular kind of, immediate solution to the kind of disconnect and the traumas that communities in Manipur, the Indians and Bangladeshis, or the people of Myanmar for that matter, they're fighting a raging, multi-sided civil war against the junta. I do not see any immediate solution. And the only way perhaps this can be overcome is using the same old cliche, let communities talk to each other, engage with each other at a very basic human level. And of course, that has to reflect in government policy at some point. But thinking that you have an election in Bangladesh or election in Myanmar, the junta is very keen now, after 4 years of civil war, to have an election. What credibility these elections will have is a question mark. Not just use elections as a kind of, as a scapegoat of sorts to really kind of wash over some really deeply traumatic histories and presence of communities that straddle India's Near East.
So, in a way, and ironically, perhaps, or not, depending on your point of view, it seems that even with this fracture or this playing to the fault lines that we've done over decades, and in many ways we continue to do so, there seems to be a greater realization, or I sincerely hope, in the New Delhi that you speak of so fondly. I do not, ladies and gentlemen, not as fondly. But the point I'm making is that it seems that the future, like the immediate past and the present and the foreseeable future, as we just talked about, seems to be predicated on realizing again and again just how interconnected this region really is, and how intricately
Absolutely.
the policies of one country, Myanmar, imploding Myanmar, direct relation to how India reacts in its northeastern plans in the northeast. The events in Bangladesh, we are looking at Bangladesh as we've not looked at Bangladesh for several decades. China's play in the region, now there is a link with Myanmar, there's a link with Nepal, Bhutan's looking warily at China, and so are we, through all these multiple lenses. And whether you call it look east or act east, how the hell does India act now? Tell me, kind of, as you see it. Kind of
how should India act now?
That's called putting him in a spot.
Putting me in this spot. Okay, I gave you the example. I'll go back to the personal that I spoke of earlier, right? The Delhi boy who's being told by friends that you don't understand. It took me a move to London to be able to write this book. And the beauty about London is it really makes you feel insignificant, how big that city is. And there sometimes I have my spats with colleagues that, guys, you really don't understand and care about the region as well, right? So I think the simple learning for me, and perhaps that I can offer to anyone else, is an element of humility. That look, you cannot solve all these problems, but trying to force a political idea from the top down is a recipe for failure. Just listen to people.
The idealism of youth, ladies and gentlemen, it's just
that's
shocking,
all I can offer.
Shocking. I tell you, absolutely shocking. Okay. But on that note, can we bring the house in, please? Very quick hand over there, the gentleman in the white shirt over there, and then I'll come to you. Do keep your questions brief and all yours.
Hi, Avinash. Thank you for the discussion. I found your insights on the presence of the Sangh in Myanmar historically to be particularly fascinating. I just had questions on that, does that also not bring in questions of the practice of caste within those communities? Because Hinduism cannot be separated from the idea of caste, more or less. And also at the same point of time, how would you consider that entire community, considering also would you say the community acquiesced to some extent to the larger exodus we saw recently in Myanmar? And I just wanted your thoughts on that.
One question? Okay, thank you.
Question.
Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Shashank? Shashank, thank you so much for that question. Look, yes, caste is important. I mean, it goes without saying. It's just that I've not looked at those dynamics, so I'm not very well positioned to actually answer your question. And that's why earlier I said that I really hope someone would look at those dynamics. I look at it from a very geopolitical, international relations perspective, right? So I'm just not very well positioned to answer that part of your question. Now, on the issue of the Burmese Indians or Myanmar Indians acquiescing to the situation on the ground, look, again, it's very difficult when you're in that position where you have generations who have been born and brought up in a country to just move lock, stock, and barrel. That kind of displacement is very, very painful. It's very dislocating. It's traumatic. And that trauma kind of, carries, it ricochets over generations. And we have seen that, a lot of the communities that moved after, in the early 60s in particular, they struggle with that memory, or personal memories in many cases, till now. So I have never gone with my biases and my opinions to the ground and say that, look, you acquiesced. No, they were in a situation. I don't know how I would have reacted were I were in their position in that sense. So everyone has their own decisions to make, and I respect them. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And then we'll come to.
Thank you for the conversation. I was just listening to your conversation. It felt like a lot of it is geopolitical. I was just interested to know if there were any interesting personalities within the region who acted as catalysts or who might be important to the people of the region when they look back at the history. Just wanted to know about it.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, if you pick up the book, which I highly recommend you do, please do. There are a lot of very important personalities. And again, to make a history which is as diverse and kind of expansive as this is, and it starts from 1937 all the way up till January 2024, right? You need the aid of some very important characters. I won't go into all of them, of course, but one character for me who stood out when I was writing that chapter was Braj Kishore Nehru. Or Biju Nehru. He was, I think, one cousin removed of the former Prime Minister of India, very close to former Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. And he was made the governor of the Northeast Council. Now, the idea of it was surreal because after 1971, the idea was, in fact, by late 1960s, 69, that because there is so much diversity in the region and there are all these movements that are asking for, asserting their ideas of identity, nationalism, that you want more federalism. The people should have their own expression. They should be able to assert some degree of autonomy, cultural, political. And the council came under the governance of one man who basically had control over everything in the entirety of India's Northeast. So that's a contradiction, which if you still go back to that moment, and he was considered to be a viceroy of Northeast, so much so that he would write in letters to the Home Minister or to the President of India that, look, and some really racist stuff, right? That, look, if I have to choose an empire, I'm not building empire, but if I have to choose an empire, I would not choose such a primitive one. I'm paraphrasing. So you can see the paternalism that is coming out. And you can see a lot of the insurgencies that we would see in the 70s, 80s, 90s. I trace it back to that one individual's very powerful desire for control. And he got the approval of Indira Gandhi at that point.
In fact, if I may just add to that, to ask you a question, the outcome of something like this, and I've maintained this, and you also indicate this in your book, is that, we tend to forget that in, for instance, what we call Northeast in India, the India's Northeast, many of the insurgencies, as we like to describe them, or rebellions, which is what they were and continue to be, is actually not against Delhi. It's against this sort of, for instance, the Mizo rebellion grew out of the misgovernance of Assam, not so much New Delhi, but it derived from the delegation that of this sort of unitary structure of looking at northeastern India. So Assam is that the Bodos in Assam, they were not railing against New Delhi, they were railing against Dispur and Guwahati, if you want to look at it that way. The Nagas were looking at New Delhi to a great extent, but they were also looking at how, for the longest time, Nagaland was being administered out of Assam and Shillong. Manipur, Assam, Shillong. With Meghalaya, absolutely, Shillong. And so there was a lot of this, and I'm sort of supplementing what Avinash just said, that the outcome of such practice is chaos. We inherited a sense, sort of fracture and chaos to a great extent, which we're now stitching back together. I'm so sorry, but I'll come to you, sir. I have a gentleman at the back.
Should we take two questions at a time?
It might be more efficient this way.
Sure.
Don't worry, I'll fit everybody in. We have time because we began late. I'll fit in as many as possible.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Mohammed Ali. My question is, sir, in the multipolar world we are living in, sir, there are a lot of platforms, the international organizations like you have got Quad is there, like ASEAN is there. When it comes to solving out the problems, all these organizations have their regional aspirations, have their regional quest and their internal politics too. How do you see that? Do they really solve out the issues, the burning issues? Are they really bothered about solving those issues in those regional areas where they are situated and forming these organizations? And second one, regarding the Bangladesh issue, sir, how do you see that in upcoming times? Would the settlement between the democratic governments will really survive and come up to the level?
So thank you for that question. Look, in terms of multilateral institutions or groupings, I mean, Quad is not even, it's not an institution. It's, some aligned states coming together for different reasons. This is a very tough balancing act for any member state of that particular grouping, right? You get the Indians and the Japanese and the Americans and the Australians together, given their history and the geography, there will be limits to how far they can agree to everything, right? And that's a struggle with even institutionalized setups, right? BIMSTEC in India, BBIN. You can see a lot of these institutions, which are very clear technical goals at times, struggle because the politics often comes in the way. And I think that is the case for even Quad to a certain extent. Now, in terms of looking in the future and looking at Bangladesh, I'm not an optimist, to be very frank with you. I think Bangladesh is going through a lot of turbulence, and we don't know which side the dust will settle. But I certainly hope there is some degree of democratic integrity that is kind of ushered into the system that emerges from the ashes of 5th of August and whatever the interim government will do for now. Because I think the only sustainable political system in Bangladesh is one that can, that can actually be inclusive in a genuine sense of the term. So yeah.
Over here, please. Sir, the young gentleman in front, and then I'll come to you.
Hi, Vatsalya. So was there ever thought about unified Bengal in 70s, since the liberation war is fought on that ethnicity, not religion? So was there ever thought about it?
Yes. Not necessarily in 1971, but the idea of a united Bengal was animating the minds of a lot of Indian leaders, at least in 1949, 1950. Absolutely. In fact, even in 1971, when the Mukti Bahini would come into its own, they needed, if you look at the maps and the slogans, when they talk about Bangladesh and liberation, on the map which shows the sun in a green backdrop, the red sun, they have a map of what Bangladesh should look like, which does not include West Bengal. So I think there was a very clear desire from India in 1971 to say that, look, unification is not what we are looking at. So just to be clear, we can support liberation, but not unification. But the idea was there earlier, yes.
The gentleman there, please.
Thank you. Ashok Mirpuri from Singapore. So, because I come from Singapore, I want you to extend the geopolitical map into Southeast Asia. You spoke about Myanmar straddling both South Asia and Southeast Asia. The problems of today in Myanmar impact China, India, Thailand, Bangladesh because of the Rohingya. How do you see the geopolitics that, a successful region in Southeast Asia, or a successful India, a successful China, yet failed states in the middle? How does this straddling take place in the geopolitics of the future? Thank you.
Thank you. So I can answer that question. It's a big question. So what I would do is I would focus my analysis mostly on the geography of the book. And honestly, on the Rohingya crisis, I mean, ASEAN could have done a lot more than it did. Let's be honest about that, right? In fact, at some point, New Delhi was hoping that, look, we'll kind of put our bandwagon with ASEAN diplomatic efforts that were being made, and that went absolutely nowhere. So much so the only interlocutor which can create strategic effect on the ground in Myanmar today is China and no one else. India to a limited extent near the borderlands, of course. Where does this leave us? China is also very present in Southeast Asia, right? And there are conversations about where is the US to a certain extent in wider ASEAN kind of bracket. So again, that's where we truly are. That's the net balance sheet of the geopolitical realities of Southeast Asia and India's Near East. You can quarrel with China's rise in this particular geography, but it's a reality that you also have to contend with.
In fact, ASEAN doesn't even use the word Rohingya at all. You'll know of this, and that's one of the problems. One last question, please, if you don't mind, because I'm getting random signals. I have stretched it to as much as I can. The gentleman at the back, please. And do continue your conversation with Avinash after this. I promise you, he will be here, or else.
I can sing a song.
No. that was a, yeah, see, we're learning. We're quick
We're
learners.
learning.
We're learning.
It seems to work.
Sir, go ahead. Kind of.
Avinash, within a generation of the Second World War, Western Europe came together and the European Union project came into being. And it has held for the last 50 years, despite all its flaws. Why do you think South Asia has struggled to build that kind of a project? Is it a function of lack of visionary leadership and execution? Thanks.
It took, and I have heard this question a lot, my goodness. If Europeans can do it, why can't we? It took a world war for Europe to learn and do that, and that is still not perfect. In fact, the European integration project, at least even in an economic sense, is facing political headwinds from far-right kind of movements even today. So, I mean, it's a suboptimal success as far as Europe goes, even though the South Asian failures are even more acute. I would just go back to the historical moment. There was no guarantee that Europe would have turned out the way it did, to be very honest with you. Kind of cascading set of historical accidents that led to liberal democracy take root in Europe, but there was no guarantee. And you can always see, the moment you see Soviet Union, the moment you see the politics of Eastern European countries, there are serious question marks about how far that project could have lasted. And you can see, temporally, that it is facing, if not a logical end, I mean, there's no logic to a particular history or a trajectory as such, but it is facing a lot of stress, even today. Yeah.
Well, and to sort of, as a sutradhar for the session, if I may have the last wrap on this, it clearly is that we need to be looking at a sort of a work in progress rather than a sort of a work in regression, which sometimes our region seems to resemble. So if Europe can come up from the ashes of Europe, it steadfastly is a work in progress. Maybe we need to be working on that. And as a sort of a near Easterner, if you will, or a great fan and sort of, I'm in love with Northeastern India and so on and so forth, and Eastern South Asia. I live and breathe the region. If I may plug the region for you, ladies and gentlemen, with a sort of a slogan, I do not think that India, or India's Near East, will hold any meaning without overlooking India's Northeast. I think we need to be looking at India's Northeast very, very closely. We can't sort of leapfrog over the Northeast into India's Near East and India's Look East or Act East or Do East or whatever you want to call it. So work in progress, ladies and gentlemen. You've been a lovely audience. Thank you very much. And please thank Avinash. And do try India's Near East, not because it says India's Near East, but because it's a damn fine book.
Well, as are Sudeep's, and I just want
Thank
to
you so
say,
much.
if you want to continue the conversation, both their books are available outside, and that would be a great way to buy the book, continue the conversation. Thank you, Avinash. Thank you, Sudeep. This is wonderful.